He thought they were trespassers. She thought her cover was blown. But when widowed single dad Toby Webb discovered Coast Guard Lieutenant Everly Gray and her twin daughters sleeping in his Vermont barn on a rain-soaked October night, he had no idea he was about to become part of a classified rescue operation that would change all their lives forever. She couldn't tell him why she was really there. He couldn't turn away 3 people who clearly needed help. What started as a simple act of shelter would uncover a dangerous secret mission, test the limits of trust, and prove that sometimes the most unexpected encounters are exactly what broken hearts need to heal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October morning mist clung to the hills of Willowbrook, Vermont like a secret the mountains weren't ready to share. Toby Webb stood on the wraparound porch of his weathered farmhouse, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the fog roll across the valley in waves that reminded him of ocean swells, though the nearest ocean was 3 hours east, and he hadn't seen it in years. At 36, Toby had grown comfortable with routines that kept his world small and predictable. Wake at 5:30, coffee on the porch, check the weather app twice, feed the chickens, wake his 8-year-old daughter Sage for school, pack her lunch with the same 3 items she'd eat: turkey sandwich, apple slices, and those crackers shaped like fish that she insisted tasted better than regular ones. The farmhouse sat on 47 acres that his grandfather had bought in 1962. Back when land was cheap and dreams were simpler. Most of the acreage had gone wild over the years. Toby kept only the vegetable garden, the chicken coop, and the old red barn that leaned slightly to the left like it was trying to hear something in the distance. The barn held hay for the neighbors, horses, tools he rarely used, and boxes of things he couldn't bring himself to sort through. Sarah's things. Even after 2 years, he couldn't decide what belonged to memory and what belonged to donation piles. "Dad, my backpack's stuck." Sage's voice echoed from inside the house, followed by the sound of something crashing to the floor. Toby smiled despite himself. His daughter had inherited her mother's determination and her father's tendency to overthink simple problems. He found her in the mudroom, tugging at her purple backpack which had somehow gotten its strap tangled around the coat hook. "Easy there. Hurricane," he said, gently working the strap free. "You've got 15 minutes before the bus." Sage looked up at him with eyes that were pure Sarah Hazel, with flecks of gold that caught the light when she was excited or frustrated. Right now, they held that particular 8-year-old brand of exasperation that suggested the universe was conspiring against her. "Mrs. Patterson wants us to bring something for the fall festival project," she said, shouldering her freed backpack. "Something that represents our family history." Toby's hands stilled. Family history projects were landmines in their house, too much past, not enough present to make sense of it all. "What kind of something?" he asked carefully. "Like old photos or recipes or stuff that shows where we come from." Sage picked up her lunchbox, which featured cartoon characters he didn't recognize, but had learned not to question. Emma's bringing her great-grandmother's wedding dress. Tyler's doing a poster about his dad's Army medals. The mention of medals made something twist in Toby's chest. Sarah had been so proud of her service record, her search and rescue commendations, the lives she'd saved during her years with the Coast Guard, but those medals now sat in a box upstairs. And Sage barely remembered her mother's stories about rough seas and midnight rescues. "We'll figure something out," Toby said. The same phrase he'd been using for 2 years, whenever life presented complications he wasn't ready to handle. "Maybe something from the garden, or one of Mom's books." Sage studied his face with the uncomfortable perceptiveness that kids develop when they've learned to read their parents' moods like weather patterns. She nodded, but he could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. The school bus arrived with its familiar wheeze of brakes, and Sage kissed his cheek before running down the gravel driveway. Toby watched until the yellow bulk disappeared around the bend, then stood in the sudden quiet of his empty house. This was the hardest part of the day, the hours between Sage leaving for school and her return at 3:30. Time moved differently when you were alone with your thoughts and a to-do list that never seemed to shrink. He'd tried filling those hours with projects, refinishing the kitchen cabinets, expanding the garden, learning to fix the tractor that had been temporarily broken for 8 months. But projects had deadlines, and deadlines meant pressure, and pressure meant the possibility of failure. It was easier to stick to maintenance, feeding chickens, checking fences, organizing tools in the barn for the third time this month. The chickens were already scratching around their coop when he approached with their morning feed. 6 hens. And 1 rooster who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Toby had inherited them from the previous owner and discovered he actually enjoyed their company. They were straightforward in their needs and didn't require emotional conversations about feelings or the future. "Morning, ladies," he said, scattering feed across their run. "How's the egg production looking today?" Henrietta, the largest hen and unofficial flock leader, gave him a look that clearly said the egg situation would improve when the weather stopped being so unpredictable. Fair enough. After the chickens, Toby walked the perimeter of the property, a habit left over from his days working private security before Sarah died and his world contracted to this small corner of Vermont. The fence line needed repair in 2 places. The old oak by the back boundary was showing signs of disease, and something had been digging near the barn foundation. The barn drew his attention, like it always did. Sarah had loved that barn, had talked about converting it into a workshop where she could restore the vintage furniture she found at estate sales. She'd had plans for everything: the barn, the garden, Sage's future room renovation, the bed and breakfast they'd fantasized about running when they got older. Plans that died with her on a fog-covered highway outside Burlington, when a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel and turned Toby from a husband into a widower in the space of a heartbeat. He pushed open the barn door and stepped into the familiar scent of hay and old wood. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, tools hanging in their designated spots, hay bales stacked in neat rows, boxes pushed against the far wall under a tarp that had seen better decades. This was his sanctuary, the place where he could pretend to be productive without actually changing anything. Sometimes he'd spend entire afternoons reorganizing the same shelves, moving tools from one pegboard to another, sweeping floors that weren't particularly dirty. Today felt different, though. There was an energy in the air, a sense of anticipation, that made him uneasy. Maybe it was the weather. The forecast called for rain later, and autumn storms in Vermont could be unpredictable. Maybe it was Sage's question about family history, stirring up memories he'd worked hard to keep settled. Or maybe it was just the approaching winter, that annual reminder that time kept moving, whether you were ready or not. Toby spent the morning replacing worn boards on the chicken coop, a job that required just enough concentration to quiet his mind without demanding real emotional investment. By lunchtime, the sky had darkened to the color of old pewter, and the first drops of rain were tapping against the barn roof like fingers drumming an impatient rhythm. He had no idea that by nightfall, his carefully ordered world would be completely transformed by 3 unexpected visitors who would challenge everything he thought he knew about second chances, courage, and the mysterious ways that broken people sometimes find exactly what they need in the most unlikely places. The storm was coming, and with it, a story that would prove that sometimes the best things in life arrive when you're least prepared to receive them. The rain began in earnest just after noon, transforming from tentative drops into a steady drumbeat against the farmhouse windows. Toby stood at the kitchen sink, washing his lunch dishes with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that small tasks completed thoroughly could hold larger chaos at bay. 1 plate, 1 fork, 1 coffee mug with a chip on the handle that he'd been meaning to replace for 6 months, but somehow never did. The chip was familiar now, fitting perfectly against his thumb like a worry stone worn smooth by repetition. Through the window above the sink, he could see the barn standing solid and dark against the gray afternoon. The building had weathered 73 Vermont winters, and it would weather this storm too. There was comfort in that kind of permanence, in structures that endured while everything else shifted and changed around them. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from his sister Claire in Burlington. "Storm's supposed to get worse tonight. You and Sage okay up there?" Toby dried his hands and typed back, "We're fine. Just rain. Just rain." But even as he sent the message, he could hear the wind picking up, rattling the loose board on the porch railing that he'd been promising to fix in spring. The farmhouse felt smaller during storms, as if the weather pressed against the walls, and reminded him how isolated they really were. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the mountain road, and cell service could be spotty when the wind got bad. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd grown to prefer the isolation though. After Sarah died, well-meaning friends and family had overwhelmed him with visits, casseroles, and advice about grief that felt like prescriptions he wasn't ready to fill. The farmhouse offered something better than sympathy: silence. Space to figure out how to be a single father without an audience evaluating his performance. The afternoon stretched ahead of him like an empty canvas he wasn't sure how to fill. Sage wouldn't be home for another 2 hours, and the rain had eliminated his usual outdoor projects. He could work on the kitchen cabinet doors he'd been sanding, or finally sort through the boxes in the spare bedroom, or tackle the stack of bills that seemed to reproduce when he wasn't looking. Instead, he found himself gravitating toward the living room and the bookshelf that still held Sarah's collection of maritime histories and rescue stories. She'd been fascinated by tales of survival at sea, of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when faced with impossible choices. People don't know what they're capable of until the water starts rising, she used to say. Toby pulled out a worn paperback about the 1952 Coast Guard rescue off Cape Cod, when a small boat had attempted to save the crew of a tanker broken in half by hurricane-force waves. Sarah had read him passages from it during their early days together, her voice animated with admiration for the rescuers who had faced almost certain death to save strangers. "Listen to this," she'd said, curled against his shoulder in their old apartment in Burlington. The boat was so small they could only take 4 men at a time, but they kept going back, again and again, until they'd saved 32 people. Can you imagine that kind of courage? At the time, Toby had been working security for a tech company, spending his days monitoring cameras and checking IDs. Sarah's stories of heroism and sacrifice had seemed like accounts from another world, populated by people made of different material than ordinary folks like him. Now, reading the same passages alone, he wondered if courage was less about fearlessness and more about acting despite fear. Sarah had certainly been afraid sometimes. He'd seen it in her face before difficult missions, the way she'd hold his hand a little tighter before deployment. But fear had never stopped her from doing what needed to be done. Fear, on the other hand, had been stopping Toby for 2 years. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed twice, its deep voice echoing through the quiet house. Sarah had loved that clock, had insisted they bring it when they moved from the apartment to the farmhouse. "It'll give the place character," she'd said, not knowing she'd never hear it chime 3,000 times. Toby closed the book and walked to the window facing the driveway. The rain was falling harder now, turning the gravel into a series of small streams that would probably wash out the low spot near the mailbox again. He'd have to spread fresh gravel next week, assuming the storm didn't knock down any trees across the road. These were the thoughts that occupied his days now: practical concerns with immediate solutions. Fence repairs and chicken feed and oil changes for the truck. Problems he could solve with tools and time and patience. Unlike grief, which seemed to have no user manual and no clear timeline for completion, his phone rang, and Sage's name appeared on the screen. The elementary school calling from her classroom, something they only did for emergencies or weather-related schedule changes. "Dad?" Sage's voice sounded small through the phone static. "Mrs. Patterson says the buses might not run if the storm gets worse. Can you come get me?" Toby was already reaching for his keys. "On my way, kiddo. Grab your rain jacket." The drive to Willowbrook Elementary normally took 15 minutes down winding mountain roads that were beautiful in good weather and treacherous when wet. Today, with rain turning the asphalt slick and wind pushing against the truck like invisible hands, the journey stretched into a white-knuckle navigation exercise that reminded Toby why Sarah had always been the better driver in bad conditions. She'd had a feel for dangerous roads, an intuition about when to slow down and when to trust momentum to carry them through. Toby drove like what he was, a cautious man who'd learned that the world could change without warning, and that the careful application of brakes was usually safer than faith in favorable outcomes. The school parking lot was chaos, parents arriving in clusters, kids emerging from the building in rain gear that made them look like colorful mushrooms, teachers directing traffic with the practiced efficiency of air traffic controllers. Toby spotted Sage immediately. She was standing under the covered walkway with her purple backpack and a drawing tube that suggested she'd finished her art project. "How bad is it supposed to get?" she asked, climbing into the truck and shaking raindrops from her hood. "Just a storm," Toby said, the same response he gave to most of Sage's weather-related concerns. "We've got plenty of food and flashlights if the power goes out." Sage nodded, but he could see her looking out at the dark sky with the same expression Sarah used to wear before difficult missions, alert, prepared, but not particularly worried. Some kids inherited their parents' eye color or height. Sage seemed to have inherited her mother's relationship with uncertainty, respectful but not afraid. "Mrs. Patterson said storms used to be sacred to some cultures," Sage said as they pulled out of the parking lot. "Like, they thought big changes could only happen during big weather. That right?" Toby navigated around a fallen branch, wondering what 8-year-olds were learning in school these days. "Yeah, she said sometimes you have to have a storm before you can have a rainbow." Toby glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. Sometimes her observations caught him off guard, carrying weight that seemed beyond her years. "What do you think about that?" Sage was quiet for a moment, watching the windshield wipers fight the rain. "I think maybe some things need to get washed away before better things can grow." As they drove home through the deepening storm, Toby couldn't shake the feeling that his 8-year-old daughter understood something about change that he'd been trying to avoid for 2 years. The farmhouse appeared through the rain like a ship anchored in rough seas, solid and welcoming, exactly as he'd left it. But that night, as the storm reached its peak and the wind howled around the eaves like something wild and untamed, Toby would discover that some changes arrive whether you're ready for them or not, and that the most important moments in life often begin with the simple decision to open a door you never expected to find. The storm reached its full fury just after 8 o'clock when Toby was helping Sage with her math homework at the kitchen table. The wind howled around the farmhouse like something alive and angry, rattling windows and sending tree branches scraping against the siding with sounds that made conversation difficult. "Dad, I can't concentrate," Sage said, looking up from her multiplication worksheets. The overhead light flickered twice, a warning that the power lines were taking a beating. "Let's finish this by the fire," Toby suggested, gathering her books. "Might be more peaceful in there." They'd just settled into the living room when the lights went out completely, plunging the house into the kind of darkness that only exists during rural storms. Toby felt around for the flashlight he kept on the mantel, its beam cutting through the black and illuminating Sage's face curious rather than frightened. "Is this the part where we tell ghost stories?" she asked hopefully. This is the part where we find the battery-powered radio and make sure we're not missing any important weather updates. Toby replied, though he was smiling. Sarah had loved storms, had taught Sage to see them as adventures rather than emergencies. It was one of the gifts she'd left behind, his daughter's ability to find excitement in uncertainty. The radio crackled to life with static and the tinny voice of the National Weather Service. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour expected through midnight. Residents in rural areas should avoid unnecessary travel and be prepared for extended power outages. Unnecessary travel, Toby repeated, setting the radio on the coffee table. Good thing we're not going anywhere. But even as he said it, something made him look toward the windows facing the barn. The building was invisible in the darkness, but he'd been watching it all evening, noting how the wind seemed to be testing its old bones. The structure was solid, but storms had a way of finding weaknesses that good weather kept hidden. A particularly violent gust shook the house, followed by a crack that sounded suspiciously like wood splitting. Toby grabbed the flashlight and moved to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. "What is it?" Sage asked. "Probably just a branch," he said, but his instincts were telling him otherwise. There was something different about that sound, not the sharp snap of a tree limb, but the deeper groan of structural wood under stress. Another gust, another crack, and this time Toby was certain it had come from the direction of the barn. "I need to check something," he told Sage, reaching for his rain jacket. "Stay here by the fire. I'll be right back." "Dad, you said unnecessary travel." "The barn's not travel, it's home maintenance," he said, pulling on his boots. "Besides, if something's wrong and I don't check it tonight, it could be a lot worse by morning." The truth was, he couldn't stand the thought of losing the barn. It was the one part of the property that still felt connected to Sarah's dreams, the space where she'd planned to build something beautiful. If the storm was damaging it, he needed to know. The rain hit him like a physical force the moment he stepped outside, soaking through his jacket before he'd taken 3 steps. The wind was worse than he'd realized, strong enough to make walking a conscious effort. The flashlight beam danced wildly as he made his way across the yard, illuminating fragments of the familiar landscape turned alien by the storm. The barn loomed ahead, darker than the surrounding darkness. As Toby approached, he could see that the main door was slightly ajar, strange, since he was certain he'd latched it securely that afternoon. Wind could be tricky, though, sometimes finding ways to work hardware loose. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, immediately grateful for the shelter from the rain. The barn felt different in the storm, alive with the sound of wind moving through gaps in the siding and rain drumming against the metal roof. His flashlight beam swept across the familiar interior, hay bales, tools, storage boxes, everything exactly as it should be. Almost everything. There, in the far corner, near the old horse stalls, something that didn't belong. Shapes that resolved themselves into impossible reality as Toby moved closer. 3 figures huddled together on a bed of hay, covered by what looked like military-issue sleeping bags. A woman and 2 small forms pressed against her sides. Toby's first instinct was to back away quietly, to pretend he hadn't seen anything and deal with this problem in the morning when the storm had passed, and daylight made everything less complicated. But then the woman stirred, lifting her head, and he found himself looking into eyes that reflected his flashlight beam like a startled deer. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm, "we're not here to cause trouble." She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of lean build that suggested physical training. Even in the poor light, there was something authoritative about her posture, the way she positioned herself between him and the 2 smaller figures. "How long have you been here?" Toby asked, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. "Since this afternoon," when the storm got bad. She shifted slightly, and Toby caught a glimpse of what looked like a uniform beneath her civilian jacket. We were traveling through, got caught in the weather. Your barn was unlocked. The two smaller figures stirred, and Toby realized they were girls, maybe 6 or 7 years old, identical faces that peered up at him with the same alert expression as their mother, twins. "I'm Lieutenant Everly Gray," the woman said, making a decision to trust him with information that seemed important. "These are my daughters, Luna and Nova. We're between assignments." Coast Guard, Toby realized, recognizing something in her bearing that reminded him of Sarah's military precision. But that raised more questions than it answered. What was a Coast Guard officer doing in a Vermont barn with 2 young girls during a storm? And why did she look like someone running from something, rather than someone on official business? "You're soaked," he said instead of asking the questions crowding his mind. "All of you." Everly nodded, and for the first time, he heard her careful composure crack slightly. "The girls' things got wet when we had to make a quick stop. I've been trying to keep them warm, but..." One of the twins, Luna or Nova, he couldn't tell which, began to shiver visibly. Despite being wrapped in what appeared to be a Coast Guard regulation sleeping bag, Toby stood in the flashlight beam for a long moment, feeling the weight of a decision he wasn't prepared to make. Every rational part of his mind suggested caution. He didn't know these people. He had Sage to think about. There were protocols for this kind of situation: calling the police, contacting social services, letting official channels handle whatever crisis had brought a Coast Guard officer and her daughters to his barn in the middle of a storm. But looking at those 2 small faces, remembering Sarah's stories about rescue missions and impossible choices, he heard his wife's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "People don't know what they're capable of until the water starts rising." "Come on," he said, stepping back and gesturing toward the barn door. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." Everly's relief was visible even in the poor light. "I can't pay you," she said quietly, gathering what appeared to be a small duffel bag. "We don't have much with us." "I didn't ask," Toby replied, echoing words from a story he'd heard 2 years ago, spoken by a man who understood that sometimes kindness was its own reward. As he helped her gather the twins and their few belongings, Toby found himself wondering what forces had brought this small family to his doorstep, in the middle of the worst storm Vermont had seen in months. Lieutenant Everly Gray clearly wasn't telling him everything. There was something in her eyes that spoke of urgency, beyond just seeking shelter from bad weather. But as they made their way through the rain toward the warm lights of his farmhouse, Toby decided that everyone deserved a safe place to wait out their storms, whatever form those storms might take. The questions could wait until morning, when the world made sense again and he could figure out what he'd gotten himself into. He had no idea that by sunrise, his carefully ordered life would be completely transformed, and that the secret Everly Gray carried would test everything he thought he knew about courage, trust, and the lengths people would go to protect the ones they loved. The transition from the barn to the farmhouse felt like crossing between 2 different worlds. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but the moment Toby opened the kitchen door and ushered Everly and her daughters inside, they were enveloped by warmth, the scent of wood smoke, and the soft glow of battery-powered lanterns. Sage looked up from where she'd been reading by the firelight, her eyes widening as she took in the unexpected visitors. To her credit, she didn't seem frightened, just intensely curious about the 3 strangers dripping rainwater onto her father's kitchen floor. "Sage, this is Lieutenant Gray and her daughters," Toby said, hanging his soaked jacket on the hook by the door. "They got caught in the storm and needed shelter." Everly stepped forward slightly, water still streaming from her hair. "You can call me Everly," she said to Sage, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that suggested she was comfortable around young people. "And these are Luna and Nova." The twins stood close to their mother, identical in everything except the way they observed their new surroundings. Luna hung back, studying the kitchen with careful attention to detail, while Nova seemed more interested in Sage herself, offering a small wave that was part greeting, part question. "Are you really twins?" Sage asked, closing her book and standing up. "You look exactly the same." "We get that a lot," Nova said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. Her voice carried a slight confidence that suggested she was used to being the spokesperson of the pair. Luna nodded but remained quiet, her dark eyes taking in everything: the battery-powered radio on the counter, the flashlights arranged on the table, the cozy disorder of a house temporarily reorganized around a power outage. "You're all soaked," Sage observed with 8-year-old directness. "Dad, they need dry clothes." Toby was already thinking the same thing. "Let me see what I can find," he said, grateful for something practical to focus on. "Sage, can you show them where the bathroom is? And maybe get some towels from the linen closet?" As the girls disappeared down the hallway, Toby found himself alone with Everly for the first time since discovering them in the barn. In the better light of the kitchen, he could see details he'd missed outside, the way she held herself with military precision despite her exhaustion, the fact that her civilian clothes couldn't quite hide what looked like a uniform underneath, and most tellingly, the way her eyes continuously scanned the windows and doors like someone accustomed to assessing potential threats. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the kitchen towel he offered. "I know this is unexpected." "Storms make everything unexpected," Toby replied, opening cabinets to inventory what he could offer. "Are the girls hungry?" "I've got soup sandwich. Fixings, probably some pasta if you prefer something warm." Everly's shoulders relaxed slightly at his matter-of-fact approach. "They haven't eaten since lunch. Luna's particular about food. She doesn't like anything too spicy or with too many ingredients mixed together." "Good to know," Toby said, filing away this small piece of parenting intelligence. "Nova? Nova will eat anything," Everly said with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "She's got her father's appetite and her own sense of adventure." The mention of the girl's father was offered casually, but Toby caught the slight tension in her voice, the way she glanced toward the windows again, as if checking for something specific. More mysteries, but he was learning that Lieutenant Everly Gray revealed information in careful layers. Sage returned with an armload of towels, followed by the twins who seemed fascinated by the battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "The power's out," Nova announced, as if this was a delightful discovery rather than an inconvenience. "We noticed," Everly said dryly. "Are you okay with that? Are you kidding?" Luna spoke up for the first time, her reserve melting slightly. "This is like camping, except with a real bathroom." Sage grinned. "Want to see my emergency kit? Dad taught me how to be prepared for anything." As the three girls gravitated toward each other with the magnetic ease of young people finding common ground, Toby disappeared upstairs to raid his dresser for anything that might work as temporary clothing. Sarah's things were still in the closet, but he wasn't ready to offer those to a stranger, even one who clearly needed help. He settled on his smallest t-shirts and sweatshirts, along with a pair of Sage's outgrown pajamas that might fit the twins. It wasn't perfect, but it was dry and warm, which seemed like the most important criteria. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Everly helping Sage prepare a simple dinner of tomato soup and grilled cheese. Sandwiches. Apparently the girls' food preferences had been easily accommodated. More importantly, he noticed how naturally Everly had slipped into the rhythm of his kitchen, finding utensils without asking, automatically checking that the gas stove was working safely with the power out. "You're good at this," he observed, watching her flip sandwiches with the confidence of someone who'd cooked under less than ideal conditions before. "Military training," she said lightly. "You learn to adapt quickly when circumstances change." The twins emerged from the bathroom wearing his oversized clothes, looking like small scarecrows, but significantly warmer. Luna had rolled up her sleeves with mathematical precision, while Nova seemed perfectly content to let the excess fabric pool around her like a fabric fort. "We look ridiculous," Luna said, but she was smiling as she said it. "You look comfortable," Sage corrected. "That's what matters when there's a storm." Dinner was eaten by lantern light around the kitchen table, with the storm providing dramatic background noise that made their small circle of warmth feel even more intimate. Toby watched the interactions carefully, the way Everly automatically cut Luna's sandwich into precise triangles without being asked, how Nova instinctively shared half her soup with her sister, the gentle way Sage included both twins in her commentary about Vermont storms and their unpredictable nature. "How long do storms like this usually last?" Everly asked, though her tone suggested the question carried more weight than simple curiosity about the weather. "Hard to say," Toby replied honestly. "Could blow through by morning, could last another day. Depends on what the mountains do to the wind patterns." Everly nodded, but he caught her checking her watch, a gesture that seemed automatic and slightly anxious. "Are you supposed to be somewhere?" he asked carefully. "Eventually," she said, which wasn't really an answer but wasn't exactly evasive either. "But not tonight. Tonight we're grateful for soup and dry clothes and a safe place to wait." After dinner, Toby set up sleeping arrangements in the living room, the couch for Everly, sleeping bags and extra blankets for the twins near the fireplace, where the warmth would keep them comfortable through the night. "I can take first watch," Everly offered as he banked the fire. "Watch for what?" Sage asked, looking up from where she was showing Luna how to fold the blankets for maximum warmth efficiency. Everly paused, clearly weighing how much truth a 8-year-old could handle. "Just making sure everyone stays safe," she said finally. "It's what I'm trained to do." "Dad does that too," Sage said matter-of-factly. "He checks all the doors twice before bed and keeps flashlights in every room. Mom used to say he was like a lighthouse keeper, always making sure the lights stayed on." Toby felt his throat tighten at the unexpected reference to Sarah, but Everly just nodded seriously. "Lighthouse keepers have important jobs," he said. "So do dads who check doors twice." As the household settled into the quiet rhythms of a storm night, Toby found himself standing at the kitchen window, watching lightning illuminate the barn where he'd found his unexpected guests just hours ago. Something about Lieutenant Everly Gray's presence felt significant beyond simple shelter-seeking. There was a tension in her alertness, a purpose in the way she'd automatically positioned herself where she could see both the front and back entrances to the house. Whatever had brought her to his barn, Toby was beginning to suspect it was more complicated than getting caught in bad weather. But as he listened to the soft voices of 3 girls comparing notes about their favorite books, he decided that some questions could wait until morning. For tonight, it was enough to provide warmth, safety, and the simple human comfort of not facing the storm alone. Dawn broke gray and quiet over Willowbrook, the storm having exhausted itself during the night like a tantrum that had finally run its course. Toby woke to the unusual sound of voices in his kitchen, not just Sage's familiar chatter, but the musical cadence of conversation that happened when children discovered they liked each other. He found them clustered around the kitchen table, still in their borrowed clothes from the night before, sharing what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast that none of them had prepared alone. Sage was demonstrating her pancake flipping technique, while Luna measured ingredients with the precision of a young scientist, and Nova provided running commentary that made all 3 girls dissolve into giggles. "Dad," Sage called when she spotted him in the doorway. "Luna knows how to make pancakes from scratch, not from a box from actual ingredients. And Nova knows like a million jokes." "A million might be an exaggeration," Nova said solemnly, then grinned. "But I do know at least 50. Everly looked up from where she was manning the coffee pot. Apparently she'd figured out how to work his ancient percolator, which even Toby sometimes struggled with. "I hope you don't mind," she said. The girls were up early, and they were determined to make breakfast for everyone. Mind? Toby accepted the mug she offered, inhaling the rich scent of perfectly brewed coffee. This is the best I've felt about a Monday morning in years. It was true, though he hadn't expected to admit it out loud. There was something energizing about waking up to a house full of life, to the sound of his daughter laughing without reservation, to the sight of his kitchen being used for something more elaborate than his usual routine of toast and instant coffee. The power came back on around 5, Everly added, gesturing to the overhead lights that were now working again. But the girls voted to keep cooking by natural light. Something about it being more like an adventure. Toby looked around the kitchen, noting details he'd missed in his first coffee haze. Someone, probably Luna, given her attention to organization, had arranged the ingredients in neat rows. Nova had apparently been put in charge of napkin distribution, because there were carefully folded paper napkins at each place setting. And Sage was wearing an expression of pure joy that he hadn't seen since before Sarah died. Adventure cooking, he said seriously. I can get behind that. The pancakes were, objectively, the best he'd ever tasted, light and fluffy, with a hint of vanilla that suggested Everly had contributed more than just supervision to the process. More importantly, they were made with the kind of collaborative energy that transformed simple food into something that felt like celebration. So what's the plan for today? Sage asked around a bite of pancake. Are Luna and Nova staying? Can we show them the chicken coop? Oh, and the tire swing behind the barn? Toby glanced at Everly, realizing he had no idea what her timeline looked like or how long they'd intended to stay. In the clear light of morning, practical questions felt more urgent than they had during the storm. We should probably get back on the road, Everly said carefully. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough. But even as she said it, Toby caught her looking out the window toward the driveway with the same alertness he'd noticed the night before. Whatever was waiting for them on the road didn't seem to fill her with anticipation. Where are you headed? He asked, keeping his tone casual. North, Everly said, which wasn't really an answer. We're between duty stations right now. Kind of figuring things out as we go. Luna looked up from her systematic approach to syrup distribution. Mom says we're on a special assignment. Luna, Everly said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made both twins go still. Nova, apparently the more diplomatic of the two, jumped in smoothly. She means we're taking a little vacation, right, Mom? Right, Mom? Everly nodded, but Toby could see the tension around her eyes. Whatever this special assignment was, it wasn't the kind of vacation that usually involved sleeping in strangers' barns during storms. Well, he said, making a decision that surprised him, the weather's supposed to be nice today. If you're not in a hurry, you're welcome to stay and let the girls explore the property. Sage has been wanting to show someone her fort in the woods, and honestly. He paused, looking around the kitchen table at 3 young faces that were hanging on his words. It's been nice having company. The relief in Everly's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Are you sure? We don't want to overstay our welcome. You're not overstaying anything, Toby said firmly. Besides, I could use help with some projects around here. And Sage could definitely use friends who appreciate adventure cooking. The girls erupted in cheers, and even Luna smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. Plans began forming immediately: the grand tour of the property, introduction to the chickens, investigation of the tire swing's structural integrity, and something Sage called the ultimate fort expedition. As the girls cleared dishes with the efficiency of a well-trained team, Everly lingered at the table with her coffee. Thank you, she said quietly. They haven't had this in a while, just being kids without worrying about anything else. What do they usually have to worry about? Toby asked gently. Everly was quiet for a long moment, staring into her mug like it might contain answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. Their father, she said finally. My ex-husband, he's He's not a good man, Toby, and he's been looking for us. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Suddenly, her alertness made sense, the way she checked windows, positioned herself strategically, asked about timelines and directions. "How long?" he asked. 3 months since we left. 2 weeks since he figured out we weren't coming back. She looked up at him, and he saw fear there, but also determination. "I have temporary custody, but he has connections. Lawyers, other military contacts. He's convinced a lot of people that I'm unstable, that I took the girls without justification." "And did you?" Everly's smile was bitter. "That depends on whether you think documenting domestic violence counts as justification, or if his friends in high places have managed to make those documents disappear." Toby felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sarah had worked with domestic violence survivors during her Coast Guard service. She'd come home from some missions with stories that kept her awake at night. Tales of women and children trapped by men who used their authority and connections as weapons. The Coast Guard knows? Some of them do. Others ... She shrugged. Others believe what they want to believe about a decorated officer and his allegedly unstable wife. Through the window, they could see the 3 girls heading toward the chicken coop, Sage in the lead and the twins following with the careful excitement of children discovering new territory. "They look happy," Toby observed. "They are happy. For the first time in months, they're acting like regular kids instead of refugees." Everly watched her daughters with an expression that mixed love and fierce protectiveness. "That's worth more than you know. So this special assignment is me trying to get them somewhere safe while I figure out how to prove what I know about their father without getting us all killed in the process." She turned back to him, studying his face. "I'm sorry to drag you into this. We can leave today if you're not dragging me into anything," Toby interrupted. "You're 3 people who needed help, and I happen to have space and time to offer it." But even as he said it, he could feel the weight of what he was taking on. This wasn't just providing temporary shelter, this was potentially becoming part of something larger and more dangerous than he'd initially understood. Outside, the girls had successfully negotiated an introduction to the chickens, and Sage's delighted laughter carried clearly through the morning air. Watching them, Toby thought about Sarah's stories of impossible rescues, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when the water started rising. Maybe courage wasn't about fearlessness after all. Maybe it was about looking at 3 people who needed safe harbor and deciding that some things were worth the risk of getting in deeper than you'd planned. "Stay," he said simply, "as long as you need to. We'll figure out the rest as we go." For the first time since he'd found them in his barn, Lieutenant Everly Gray looked like she believed that safety might actually be possible. 3 days had passed since the storm, and the farmhouse had settled into rhythms that felt surprisingly natural. The girls had claimed a spare bedroom upstairs, transforming it into a base camp complete with detailed maps of the property that Luna had drawn with architectural precision, and Nova's collection of emergency snacks carefully arranged in what she called strategic locations. Everly had proven herself invaluable around the farm. She could fix a leaky faucet, knew how to properly maintain a wood-burning stove, and had somehow convinced the temperamental generator to start on the first pull every time. More importantly, she'd brought something back to life in Sage that Toby had feared was lost forever. The sound of his daughter's unreserved laughter echoing through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. It was Thursday afternoon when everything changed. Toby was in the barn, teaching all 3 girls how to properly stack hay bales, a skill Sage had been requesting for months, and that Luna and Nova approached with the same scientific interest they brought to everything else. The afternoon sun streamed through the open doors, creating patterns of light and shadow that made the simple work feel almost ceremonial. "The key is weight distribution," he was explaining, watching Nova attempt to maneuver a bale that was almost as big as she was. You want the heaviest ones on the bottom, and his phone rang, interrupting the lesson. Claire's name appeared on the screen, which was unusual. His sister typically texted rather than called during work hours. "Hold on, girls," he said, stepping outside to take the call. "Claire, what's up, Toby?" Her voice carried an urgency that made him instantly alert. "I need you to listen carefully. There are 2 men here at the hospital asking questions about you." Ice formed in his stomach. What kind of questions? Official questions. They showed badges, said they were following up on a missing persons case. They wanted to know if you'd had any unusual visitors recently, any strangers staying at the property. Through the barn door, Toby could see Everly freeze, her attention locked on his conversation despite the distance. Luna and Nova continued playing, oblivious, but their mother had clearly heard enough to understand that something was wrong. "What did you tell them?" Toby asked, keeping his voice level. "Nothing. I told them I hadn't spoken to you in weeks and suggested they contact you directly if they had questions." Claire paused. "Toby, who are these people asking about? And why do I get the feeling you're about to tell me something I'm not going to like?" Before he could answer, the sound of vehicles coming up his gravel driveway cut through the afternoon. Quiet. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows, moving with the purposeful speed of people who knew exactly where they were going. "Claire, I have to go," he said quickly. "If anyone else asks, you haven't heard from me." "Toby, what the hell?" He ended the call and sprinted toward the barn, where Everly was already moving with military efficiency. In the time it had taken him to walk 20 feet, she'd positioned herself where she could see the approaching vehicles, while keeping the girls behind her. "How many?" she asked tersely. 2 SUVs, Toby replied, his mind racing through options that all seemed inadequate. "Maybe 6 people total. Weapons? I don't know. Claire said they had badges, so probably official." Everly's expression went cold and focused in a way that reminded him she was a trained Coast Guard officer, not just a mother seeking shelter. Official doesn't mean legitimate. And it definitely doesn't mean safe. The vehicles had stopped in front of the farmhouse, their engines still running. Through the barn windows, Toby could see men emerging dressed in business suits that looked out of place in rural Vermont, moving with the coordinated precision of people accustomed to this kind of work. "Girls," Everly said quietly, not taking her eyes off the approaching figures, "I need you to listen very carefully. We're going to play a game called Forest Explorers. Luna, you remember the trail map you drew yesterday?" Luna nodded, her face serious as she picked up on the adult tension filling the barn. "Good. You and Nova are going to take Sage and follow the blue trail to the back boundary. Find a good hiding spot and wait for the all-clear signal." "What's the all-clear signal?" Sage asked, her voice small but steady. 3 short whistle blasts, then 2 long ones, Everly said without hesitation. "Don't come back for any other sound, no matter what you hear. Understand?" The girls nodded, and Toby felt a surge of pride at how quickly they'd shifted into emergency mode. Sage grabbed the small backpack she'd started carrying on their property adventures, while Luna and Nova moved with the practiced efficiency of children who'd learned to pack quickly when adults said it was time to go. "Take this," Toby said, handing Sage his backup flashlight. "And remember what your mom taught you about wilderness safety. Stay together, follow water downstream if we get lost, and find shelter before dark." Sage recited, then looked up at him with eyes that were too knowing for 8 years old. "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" "We're going to be fine," he said, hoping it was true. "This is just adult stuff that needs to be handled by adults." As the girls disappeared through the barn's back entrance, melting into the forest with the silent grace of small ghosts, Everly turned to Toby with an expression that mixed regret and determination. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I knew this was a possibility, but I hoped we had more time." "Time for what?" "To get what I came here for." She pulled something from her jacket pocket, a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. My ex-husband isn't just looking for me and the girls, Toby. He's looking for evidence that I stole something from him. Something that proves he's been using his Coast Guard connections to run drugs through ports from Maine to Florida. Toby stared at her, pieces clicking into place. You're not running from domestic violence. I'm running from both, she corrected. Marcus, my ex, he's smart enough to use personal threats to discourage professional investigation. Hard to pursue a corruption case when you're afraid for your children's lives. Through the barn windows they could see the men spreading out, some heading for the farmhouse while others began searching the outbuildings. Professional, thorough, and clearly not interested in waiting for permission. So what did you steal? Everly's smile was grim. Financial records, shipping manifests, communication logs. Everything needed to prove that Lieutenant Commander Marcus Gray has been using Coast Guard resources to facilitate drug trafficking for the past 3 years. And you hid it here? I hid it somewhere he'd never think to look. Somewhere that required me to establish trust with someone completely outside his circle of influence. She looked at him directly. I've been uploading the files to a secure server, but I needed time and a stable internet connection to complete the transfer, time that ran out about 30 seconds ago. The sound of the farmhouse door being forced open echoed across the yard, followed by voices shouting orders in the tone of people accustomed to immediate compliance. What do they want? Toby asked. Me, the girls, and any evidence I might have gathered. Everly checked her watch, then looked toward the forest where the children had disappeared. But mostly they want to make sure I never get a chance to testify. And if they find us? Everly's expression went completely cold. Then we become a tragic example of what happens to unstable ex-wives, who make false accusations against decorated military officers. The barn door shuddered as someone began trying to force it open. Toby realized they had maybe 60 seconds before their sanctuary became a trap. Back door? He asked. Already locked down. I can see another team positioned there. Windows? 2. High, too visible. Toby looked around desperately, then remembered something from his grandfather's stories about the property. The root cellar, he said, under the main storage area. It connects to an old tunnel that comes out near the stone fence. Can you get to it without being seen? Maybe, if we move now. As footsteps approached the barn and voices grew louder. Outside, Toby found himself faced with a choice that would define everything that came after. Retreat to safety and let Lieutenant Everly Gray face whatever came next alone. Or step fully into a situation that was far more dangerous than anything he'd ever willingly encountered. He thought about Sarah's stories of impossible rescues, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when the water started rising. He thought about 3 girls hiding in the forest, depending on the adults in their lives to keep them safe. This way, he said, moving toward the hidden entrance his grandfather had shown him 30 years ago. Stay close, and whatever happens, we don't let them find those girls. Behind them, the barn door finally gave way, and voices filled the space they'd just vacated. The real test was about to begin. The root cellar smelled of earth and decades old. Preserves, its stone walls weeping moisture that made every breath feel thick and urgent. Toby led Everly through the narrow space by feel more than sight, his grandfather's voice echoing across 30 years of memory. Built this during the war. Tommy, sometimes a man needs more than one way out of his own property. Above them, boots thundered across the barn floor, accompanied by voices that carried the authority of people accustomed to finding what they were looking for. Toby could hear furniture being moved, hay bales shifted, the methodical sounds of a professional search that would eventually, inevitably, lead them to the concealed entrance. How far? Everly whispered, her breath warm against his ear in the cramped tunnel. 50 yards, maybe 60. Toby felt along the rough stone walls, searching for the turn he remembered from childhood adventures. The tunnel comes out behind a rock pile near the back fence line. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. 30 years was a long time, and memory had a way of making distances shorter and obstacles smaller than they actually were. What if the exit was blocked? What if the tunnel had collapsed? What if his grandfather's old escape route had become their tomb? The sound of splintering wood echoed from above. They'd found the cellar entrance. "Move," Everly said, pushing him forward with gentle urgency. "Whatever's ahead has to be better than what's behind us." They crawled through darkness that felt absolute, guided only by the rough texture of stone walls and the hope that the tunnel actually led somewhere useful. Toby's hands were bleeding by the time he felt cool air against his face and realized they'd reached the exit, a narrow opening, concealed behind a tangle of wild raspberry bushes that had grown across the entrance. Like nature's own camouflage, they emerged into afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the tunnels. Blackness, both of them covered in dirt and moving with the careful urgency of people who weren't sure if they were safe or just temporarily hidden. "The girls," Everly said immediately, scanning the forest for any sign of the 3 small figures who had disappeared into the trees 20 minutes earlier. Toby put 2 fingers to his lips and delivered the all-clear signal, 3 short whistles. 2 long ones, then waited in the kind of silence that made seconds feel like hours. The response came from deeper in the forest than he'd expected. Sage's voice calling "Dad," followed by the sound of 3 sets of feet crashing through underbrush with the subtlety of excited rhinoceros. They appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale. Luna with leaves in her hair and a notebook clutched against her chest, Nova with mud on her cheeks and a grin that suggested she'd found the whole experience delightfully adventurous, and Sage looking older than 8 and younger than anything should require a person to be. "Are we okay?" Sage asked, running directly into Toby's arms with the force of someone who'd been holding fear at bay through sheer determination. "We're okay," he said, holding her tight and meaning it for the first time since the SUVs had appeared in his driveway. "You did exactly right, kiddo." Luna and Nova converged on their mother with the same desperate relief, and for a moment, the forest filled with the kind of reunion that suggested they'd all understood exactly how serious the situation had been. "What now?" Everly asked, keeping her voice low despite their temporary safety. Toby looked back toward the farmhouse, where he could see figures moving through his kitchen, searching through rooms that contained nothing more dangerous than coffee, mugs, and Sage's homework assignments. His home had been violated, his quiet life disrupted, and yet standing here in the forest with 4 people who'd become important to him in ways he couldn't quite explain, he felt more clarity than he'd experienced in years. "Now we figure out how to finish what you started," he said. They made their way deeper into the forest, following deer trails that led to a clearing where Toby had built a simple shelter years ago, originally intended as a hunting blind. It had become one of Sage's favorite reading spots and the location of countless tea parties with stuffed animals who appreciated nature's ambience. It was there, in the dappled sunlight of a makeshift sanctuary, that the walls finally came down. The girls settled into the kind of busy quiet that children create when they're processing adult tension, organizing Luna's notebooks and Nova's snack collection, while staying close enough to hear any important announcements. Sage pulled out the small emergency kit Toby had taught her to carry, distributing water bottles with the seriousness of someone who understood that preparation mattered when safety was uncertain. Everly sat against a fallen log, finally allowing exhaustion to show in her shoulders. "This isn't what I planned," she said quietly. "When I decided to gather evidence against Marcus, I thought I was protecting the girls. Instead, I've put them and you in more danger than they ever would have faced if I just stayed quiet." "Staying quiet would have kept them safe?" Toby asked. "Staying quiet would have kept them with their father, but alive." Everly's voice carried the weight of a choice that had been eating at her for months. Marcus never hurt them directly. He saved his violence for me. They would have grown up with a father who was a criminal, but they would have grown up. And you? Everly shrugged, the gesture carrying years of resigned acceptance. I would have found a way to disappear myself eventually. Women in bad marriages learn how to become ghosts. Toby watched his daughter carefully sharing crackers with the twins. Her natural generosity on full display, even in circumstances that should have made sharing feel dangerous. Sarah used to say that staying alive wasn't the same as living, he said finally. Your wife was Coast Guard too? SAR coordinator. Search and rescue. Toby felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied discussions of Sarah's work. She spent 10 years pulling people out of impossible situations, and then died because a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Everly was quiet for a long moment, understanding that some stories required silence to be fully heard. I couldn't save her, Toby continued, voicing something he'd never said aloud to anyone. All those years of watching her risk everything to save strangers, and when she needed saving, I was home making dinner and helping Sage with multiplication tables. You couldn't have known. That's what everyone says. Toby's voice was rougher than he'd intended. Claire, the grief counselor, Sage's teacher. Everyone who wants to make me feel better about the fact that I built my whole life around keeping people safe. And the one person who mattered most died while I was worried about whether we had enough milk for breakfast. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unpolished in the way that truth often was. Is that why you've been hiding up here? Everly asked gently. Because if you don't get close to anyone, you can't fail to save them. Toby looked at her, surprised by the accuracy of her observation. You'd make a good therapist. I'd make a terrible therapist. I can see other people's patterns clearly, but my own. She gestured toward the forest around them, where they were hiding from the consequences of her choices. I convinced myself that gathering evidence against Marcus was about justice, about protecting other families from what he's doing. But really, it was about proving that I'm not the weak, helpless woman he spent 5 years telling me I was. And now? Now I've proven that I'm strong enough to put everyone I care about in mortal danger. Everly watched Luna explaining something to Sage with the patience of a natural teacher. My daughters are hiding in the woods because their mother decided her pride was worth more than their safety. Your daughters are hiding in the woods because their father is a criminal who threatens people to avoid consequences. Toby corrected. There's a difference, is there? Because from where I'm sitting, the result looks the same. Toby considered this, watching Nova attempt to teach Sage a complicated hand-clapping game that involved more laughter than actual coordination. Sarah used to say that the hardest part of rescue work wasn't the physical danger. It was learning to live with the fact that you couldn't save everyone, and that sometimes your best efforts still weren't enough. How did she handle it? She said you had to focus on the people you did save, not the ones you couldn't. And that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. Everly followed his gaze to where the 3 girls had moved on to some kind of elaborate game involving Luna's notebooks, Nova's dramatic storytelling abilities, and Sage's skill at creating rules that everyone could follow. I've been afraid for so long, Everly said quietly. Afraid of Marcus, afraid of what he might do to the girls, afraid that I'm not strong enough to protect them. And then I became afraid that fighting back would make everything worse. And now? Now I'm afraid that I've dragged a good man and his daughter into something that might get them killed. She looked at Toby directly. You should take Sage and disappear. Go to your sister's house or somewhere Marcus doesn't know to look. Let me handle this on my own. Like you've been handling it for the past 3 months? The question stung, but it was fair. Everly had been running, hiding, making tactical decisions based on fear rather than strategy. She'd gathered evidence, but hadn't figured out how to use it safely. She'd protected her daughters' bodies, but hadn't been able to give them a stable home. She'd maintained her courage, but lost her hope. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I know how to follow orders, how to execute rescue missions, how to save people who are drowning. But I don't know how to save my own family from someone who's supposed to love them." Toby was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter show the twins how to identify different types of leaves, a skill Sarah had taught her during their nature walks, now being passed on to children who needed new knowledge for survival. "When Sarah died," he said finally, "I thought my job was to keep Sage safe by keeping her away from anything that might hurt her. No risky activities, no new people, no situations I couldn't control completely. It took me 2 years to realize that the safest thing I could do for Sage was teach her how to be brave." "She is brave," Everly said, watching Sage demonstrate proper whistle technique for emergency signaling. "She's handling all of this with more grace than most adults would. She learned that from her mother, but she learned to trust strangers and take care of people who need help. I think she learned that this week from watching you." Everly felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of guilt and self-doubt she'd been carrying. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe courage isn't about handling everything alone. Maybe it's about building something strong enough to protect the people you love, even when you can't control all the variables." Through the trees, they could hear the distant sound of engines starting, the search teams leaving his property, temporarily defeated, but certainly not finished. "They'll be back," Everly said. "Probably. But next time, we'll be ready for them." "We?" Toby looked at her, thinking about Sarah's stories of impossible rescues, about the moment when ordinary people decided to risk everything for strangers who needed saving. "I've been afraid for 2 years," he said. "Afraid of letting anyone matter. Enough to lose them. But these past few days, watching Sage laugh again, seeing you fight for your daughters, I think fear is just another kind of drowning. And Sarah spent her whole career teaching people that the only way to survive drowning is to stop fighting the water and start swimming toward shore." Everly smiled, the first genuinely hopeful expression he'd seen from her since that night in the barn. "So what's the shore look like?" she asked. Toby gestured toward the 3 girls, who had moved on to some kind of elaborate fort-building project using fallen branches and Nova's infinite capacity for architectural optimism. "It looks like us," he said. "All of us together, figuring out how to make something strong enough to last." As afternoon settled into evening and they began planning their next moves, Toby realized that courage had never been about fearlessness after all. It was about looking at the people who mattered most and deciding that love was worth whatever risks came with it. The water was rising, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to swim. 2 weeks had passed since the search teams had invaded the farmhouse, and life had settled into rhythms that felt both purposeful and surprisingly natural. The back bedroom had been officially designated as Luna and Nova's room, complete with hand-drawn maps, a carefully organized art station, and 2 small beds that Toby had assembled from kits while the girls offered enthusiastic supervision and only moderately helpful advice. Everly had transformed the kitchen table into a command center each morning after breakfast, spreading out documents, maps, and the laptop computer that Toby had driven to Burlington to purchase with cash. No credit cards, no digital trails that could be traced back to his property. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that strategy mattered more than speed, building an airtight case that could survive legal challenges and protect them all from retaliation. The shipping manifests don't match the Coast Guard fuel consumption reports, she explained to Toby one morning while the girls were outside feeding chickens and conducting what Nova had termed important agricultural research. "Marcus has been ordering extra fuel for training exercises that never actually happened, then selling it to smugglers at ports along the eastern seaboard." Toby studied the spreadsheet over her shoulder, noting the careful way she'd cross-referenced Dates, locations, and quantities. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $2.7 million over 3 years. Everly highlighted another discrepancy with the precision of someone who'd learned that details mattered when lives were at stake. But the real crime isn't the theft, it's what he helped transport. Drugs, weapons, people who didn't have documentation to be here legally. Through the window, they could see Sage demonstrating proper chicken feeding technique while Luna took notes, and Nova provided running commentary that made all 3 girls dissolve into periodic fits of laughter. The sight had become routine over the past 2 weeks, but it still made Toby smile in ways that felt like coming back to life. "What's our timeline?" He asked. FBI expects the full evidence package by Friday. After that, it's out of our hands and into the federal court system. Everly saved her work and closed the laptop with the careful movements of someone who knew that one wrong keystroke could destroy months of careful documentation. The question is whether we can stay hidden long enough for the arrests to happen. It was a question that had occupied most of their planning sessions. Marcus Gray had resources, connections, and the kind of institutional protection that came with 15 years of exemplary service records. More importantly, he had the desperation of someone who understood that exposure meant losing everything: his career, his freedom, his carefully constructed image as a decorated officer and devoted father. "Claire called yesterday," Toby said, pouring coffee that had become part of their morning ritual. "The hospital administrator wants to know when I'm coming back to work." Everly looked up sharply. "Are you thinking about it?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things." Toby handed her the mug and settled into the chair across from her, a position that had become theirs over countless morning conversations. "My leave runs out next month. Sage needs to be enrolled in school somewhere. And you and the girls need more than just temporary shelter." They'd been avoiding this conversation for 2 weeks, focusing on immediate safety concerns and legal strategies, rather than addressing the larger question of what happened when the crisis was over. But watching their daughters build fort cities in the barn and compare notes about their favorite books, it was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend that this was just a temporary arrangement. "I've been thinking too," Everly said carefully, "about what comes after. The Coast Guard will reassign me once Marcus is arrested, probably somewhere far from New England, where the scandal won't follow me. Where would you want to go?" "I don't know," she admitted. "For 3 years, I planned my life around avoiding Marcus. For the past 6 months, I've planned around exposing him. I haven't thought much about what I actually want for me and the girls." Sage's laughter echoed from the yard, followed by Luna's more reserved chuckle and Nova's dramatic exclamation about something undoubtedly related to chicken behavior. Sound had become the soundtrack of their mornings, as familiar and necessary as coffee and sunrise. "What if," Toby said slowly, testing words that felt both terrifying and inevitable, "what if you didn't have to go anywhere?" Everly went very still. Toby ... "I know it's complicated. I know we're both carrying a lot of history, and that timing isn't perfect, and that there are practical considerations." "Toby," she interrupted gently, "what are you saying?" He looked at her across the table where they'd shared 2 weeks of morning coffee, evening planning sessions, and the kind of quiet conversations that happened when people discovered they trusted each other with their most frightening truths. "I'm saying this place is big enough for 5 people. I'm saying Sage has never been happier than she has been these past 2 weeks. I'm saying that maybe we've accidentally built something here that's worth making permanent." Everly's eyes filled, but she was smiling as she said, "That's a lot of maybes. Sarah used to say that the best rescue started with someone being willing to take a leap, without knowing exactly where they'd land." Before Everly could respond, the kitchen door burst open with the force of 3 excited girls who had apparently made an important discovery. "Dad," Sage announced breathlessly. Luna figured out how to make the chickens lay eggs in perfect rows, and Nova taught them a song, and we think Henrietta might actually be a genius. Also, Nova added seriously, we've been discussing living arrangements. Toby and Everly exchanged glances across the table, the look of adults who'd just discovered that children were often more perceptive than anyone gave them credit for. What kind of living arrangements? Everly asked carefully. Luna stepped forward with the diplomatic precision she brought to most family discussions. We've been comparing notes about our current situation, and we have some observations. Such as, Sage said, taking over with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been elected spokesperson. You guys are obviously in love. This house is definitely big enough for all of us, and Luna and Nova make excellent sisters. Also, Nova added, the chickens have voted, and they prefer having 5 people to take care of them instead of just 2. Toby felt something expand in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with the realization that love sometimes arrived in groups, transforming individual lives into something larger and more resilient than any of them could have built alone. Well, he said solemnly, if the chickens have voted ... is that a yes? Luna asked, her usual reserve cracking to reveal the hope underneath. Everly reached across the table and took Toby's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt like a promise and a leap of faith all at once. That's definitely a yes, she said. The cheer that erupted from 3 girls could probably be heard halfway to Burlington, but Toby didn't care. For the first time in 2 years, his house felt like a home where the future was something to anticipate rather than endure. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter, but inside, something was blooming that felt strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. The call came on a Wednesday morning in early December, while frost painted intricate patterns on the kitchen windows, and the girls were upstairs arguing about whose turn it was to choose the music for their morning routine. Everly answered her phone with the careful tension she'd maintained for weeks, but her posture changed immediately when she heard the voice on the other end. Agent Morrison, she said, and Toby looked up from where he was packing Sage's lunch, recognizing the name of the FBI contact who'd been handling Marcus's case. The conversation was brief, professional, and punctuated by Everly's carefully controlled responses. Understood. When? All of them? Thank you. When she ended the call, she sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, staring at the phone as if it might ring again with different news. It's over, she said finally. Marcus was arrested this morning in Norfolk. Him and 6 other officers involved in the smuggling operation. Federal marshals are executing search warrants on his properties, his bank accounts, everything. Toby set down the sandwich he'd been wrapping and moved to the chair beside her. How do you feel? I don't know, Everly admitted. I've been focused on this for so long, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel now that it's actually finished. Through the ceiling, they could hear the girls' laughter, followed by the sound of feet thundering down the stairs. Luna appeared first, followed by Nova and Sage, all 3 wearing the kind of elaborate winter clothing that suggested they'd dress themselves without adult supervision. Mom, Nova announced, we've decided that today should be a celebration day, but we can't agree on what we're celebrating. I vote for snow, Sage said, pointing toward the windows where large flakes had begun falling during breakfast. First real snow of the season deserves recognition. I vote for Luna finishing her book about chicken behavior, Nova countered. That's actual accomplishment. Luna, ever diplomatic, offered a compromise. We could celebrate both. And the fact that Mom looks like she has good news. Everly smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Toby had seen from her in weeks. You're very observant, Luna. I do have good news. She told them about the arrests in language that 8-year-olds could understand. Their father had been caught doing something wrong at work. He wouldn't be looking for them anymore, and they were safe to stay in Vermont as long as they wanted. Girls received this information with the resilience that had carried them through months of uncertainty, asking practical questions about school enrollment and whether they could keep their bedroom permanently, but not dwelling on the details of what their father's arrest meant for their future relationship with him. "So we're really staying?" Nova asked, seeking confirmation of what had become increasingly obvious over the past month. "If Toby and Sage will have us," Everly said, looking across the table at the man who'd become the center of her new definition of home. "I think we can manage that," Toby said solemnly. "Though you'll have to submit to Henrietta's approval. She's particular about permanent residence." After the girls bundled themselves back upstairs to continue whatever elaborate winter preparations they'd been conducting, Toby and Everly found themselves alone with the magnitude of what they were actually committing to. "We should probably make this official," Everly said. "Not just for us, but for the girls. They need legal stability, school enrollment, medical records transferred. All the practical things that come with actually belonging somewhere." "What kind of official?" Everly smiled. "I was thinking marriage if you're interested. Nothing elaborate, just us, the girls, and whatever legal protections come with being an actual family instead of people who happen to be living together." Toby felt his heart do something that felt like both a skip and a settling, the recognition of something he'd wanted without knowing he was allowed to want it. "Sarah and I never got around to planning a big wedding," he said carefully. "We were young and broke and figured we'd have plenty of time for celebrations later." "I'm not Sarah," Everly said gently. "And I'm not asking you to recreate something you had before. I'm asking if you want to build something new with me. What would that look like? Honest, I have no idea." Everly laughed, and it sounded like relief mixed with anticipation. "I've never been married to someone I actually wanted to stay married to. But I'm thinking maybe we figure it out as we go, same way we've figured out everything else." They planned the ceremony for New Year's Day, reasoning that starting the new year as an official family had symbolic appeal that even the girls could appreciate. Claire agreed to serve as witness and unofficial photographer, bringing her husband and two teenagers who would provide what Sage described as appropriate wedding attendance numbers. The location was never in question, the maple tree behind the farmhouse, where autumn had first brought them together and winter was now wrapping them in the kind of crystalline beauty that made promises feel both sacred and permanent. Everly found a simple dress in Burlington, cream-colored wool that would be warm enough for an outdoor ceremony and practical enough to wear again for other special occasions. Toby bought a suit that fit properly and made him look like someone prepared to make lifelong commitments. The girls took their roles as wedding planners with the seriousness of people who understood they were helping design their own future. Luna created detailed schedules and backup plans for weather contingencies. Nova appointed herself director of decorations, stringing lights through the maple's bare branches and arranging candles in glass jars that would protect them from wind. Sage took charge of music, creating a playlist that balanced her father's preference for classic country with Everly's love of folk music and the twins' inexplicable devotion to songs about friendship and adventure. On the morning of the ceremony, while Everly was getting ready upstairs and the girls were conducting final preparations outside, Toby found himself standing in his bedroom, holding the small velvet box that contained his grandmother's wedding ring, the one Sarah had worn. The one he'd put away after her funeral and thought he'd never need again. It felt right to offer it now, not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as a bridge between the love he'd carried and the love he was choosing to build. The ceremony itself was simple, heartfelt, and interrupted only once when Nova had to readjust the decorations because the wind was affecting the aesthetic balance, and once when Henrietta decided to investigate the gathering and had to be gently relocated away from the designated ceremony space. They wrote their own vows, speaking words that acknowledged their individual histories while promising to build something together that would be strong enough to weather whatever storms life might bring. The girls stood beside them as witnesses, wearing matching dresses that Luna had insisted were appropriately formal, but not excessively fancy. When they exchanged rings and shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the cheer that went up from their small audience was loud enough to echo off the mountains. But the sound that mattered most to Toby was quieter, the contented sigh from his new stepdaughters, the sound of people who'd finally found their way home. As evening fell and their guests headed back to Burlington, the new family of 5 sat around the kitchen table sharing wedding cake and making plans for the year ahead. School enrollment for Luna and Nova, summer garden expansion, the possibility of adding a few more chickens to their flock, ordinary plans made extraordinary by the knowledge that they would face them together, as a family built not by chance or obligation, but by the conscious choice to love each other, through whatever came next. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the farmhouse and barn in pristine white that made everything look new and full of possibility. Inside, 5 people who'd found their way to each other through storms and secrets, and the simple courage to keep trying, settled into the warm certainty of home. 3 years later, on a crisp October morning that carried the scent of apple cider and wood smoke, Toby Webb stood on his front porch watching his wife and daughters harvest the last of the season's vegetables from their expanded garden. The scene had become as familiar as sunrise, but it still filled him with the kind of quiet amazement reserved for gifts you never expected to receive. Everly moved through the rows with the efficient grace of someone who discovered that growing things from scratch was remarkably similar to building a life from broken pieces. Both required patience, faith, and the willingness to tend carefully to small daily tasks that might not show results for months. She wore jeans and one of his old flannel shirts, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail that had become her signature look since leaving the Coast Guard and accepting a position with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. "Dad, can you help us carry the pumpkins?" Sage called from where she was attempting to lift a gourd that appeared to weigh almost as much as she did. At 11, she'd grown tall and confident, with the kind of easy laughter that suggested she'd never doubted her place in the world, or her family's ability to keep her safe. Luna and Nova flanked her, now 9 years old and distinct individuals despite their identical features. Luna had developed into the family's unofficial scientist, approaching everything from homework to chicken care with methodical precision that would have made her Coast Guard mother proud. Nova remained the storyteller, turning daily adventures into elaborate narratives that usually featured brave heroines, talking animals, and triumph over adversity through the power of creativity and friendship. "Coming," Toby replied, making his way down the porch steps toward what had become known as the Great Pumpkin Migration, an annual tradition that marked the transition from harvest season to preparation for winter. The farmhouse behind him bore the marks of 3 years of expansion and improvement. The wraparound porch had been extended, creating space for the outdoor reading nook that all 3 girls claimed on sunny afternoons. The barn had been partially converted into Everly's workshop, where she restored furniture found at estate sales, and built custom pieces for neighbors who discovered that the new Mrs. Webb had talents that extended far beyond her federal law enforcement background. Most importantly, the house rang with the sounds of a family that had learned to be happy together. Morning laughter, evening conversations, the comfortable chaos of 3 girls who considered each other sisters in every way that mattered. "This one's definitely going to win the contest at school," Nova announced, patting a particularly round pumpkin with the satisfaction of someone who understood aesthetic excellence. "Only if they're judging on personality," Luna replied with the gentle precision she brought to most of Nova's more enthusiastic pronouncements. The contest criteria specifically mentioned size, symmetry, and absence of blemishes. "Personality should count," Sage said diplomatically. "But Luna's probably right about the judging standards. Toby smiled, listening to the kind of sibling discussion that Sarah would have loved: detailed, affectionate, and conducted with the assumption that everyone's opinion mattered, even when they disagreed about pumpkin contest strategy. As they loaded vegetables into baskets and wheelbarrows, neighbors began arriving for what had become the annual harvest celebration, an informal gathering that had started with Claire and her family but had gradually expanded to include most of the families within a 5-mile radius. The event served multiple purposes: community building, celebration of the growing season's end, and an excuse for everyone to share their best apple-based recipes while children played elaborate games of hide-and-seek among the hay bales. Lieutenant Gray called Tom Harrison, whose farm bordered their eastern property line. Despite Everly's repeated requests that people call her by her first name, half the community remained impressed by her law enforcement background and insisted on maintaining what they considered appropriate respect for her service record. "Just Everly," she replied automatically, accepting his handshake with the grace of someone who'd learned to balance professional accomplishments with the desire to be seen as a neighbor rather than a celebrity. "How's the new job treating you?" "Like exactly what I was meant to be doing," Everly said honestly. The transition from Coast Guard service to wildlife management had surprised everyone, including herself, but 3 years in, she couldn't imagine doing anything else. Her work involved protecting natural resources, educating the public about environmental conservation, and occasionally participating in search and rescue operations that utilized her Coast Guard training in entirely new contexts. As the afternoon progressed, Toby found himself moving through familiar rhythms, tending the fire in the outdoor pit where they roasted corn and warmed cider, helping children navigate complicated playground disputes, engaging in the kind of casual conversation with neighbors that made rural Vermont feel like the kind of place where people looked out for each other without making a big production of their kindness. But it was during a quiet moment, when the girls were occupied with some elaborate treasure hunt, and the adults were sharing coffee and watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountain ridge, that Claire pulled him aside. "You know," she said, studying his face with the attention of someone who'd watched him carefully for 3 years, "you look like Dad." "I look like Dad?" "Happy Dad. The way he used to look when all his kids were home for dinner and Mom was laughing at something ridiculous he'd said." Claire smiled. Content, like someone who figured out what he was supposed to be doing with his life. Toby considered this, watching Everly help Luna set up some kind of scientific experiment involving leaves, water, and what appeared to be borrowed laboratory equipment from the girls' school. Sage and Nova were providing commentary and comic relief, turning the educational demonstration into impromptu entertainment that had attracted an audience of curious adults. "I think," he said slowly, "I finally learned the difference between keeping people safe and helping them be brave." "What's the difference?" "Safe is about controlling circumstances. Brave is about building people strong enough to handle whatever circumstances show up." As evening approached and neighbors began gathering their children and empty casserole dishes, Toby and Everly found themselves on the front porch, watching their daughters conduct what appeared to be some kind of formal ceremony involving the day's most perfect pumpkin and a considerable amount of theatrical solemnity. "Any regrets?" Everly asked, settling into the porch swing that had become their evening tradition. "About which part?" "Any of it. All of it. Taking us in, marrying someone with complicated history, inheriting 2 kids along with a wife." Toby was quiet for a moment, thinking about the man he'd been 3 years ago, careful, isolated, convinced that love was too dangerous to risk twice in one lifetime. "My only regret," he said finally, "is that it took a storm to bring you here, instead of something easier." "Easier wouldn't have worked," Everly replied with certainty. "People like us don't change direction during good weather. We needed something big enough to make staying the same more frightening than risking something new." From the yard, Sage's voice rose in mock outrage as Luna apparently disputed some crucial element of the pumpkin ceremony, while Nova attempted to mediate with the diplomatic skills she'd developed as the family's unofficial ambassador to any situation requiring creativity and compromise. "Think they'll remember this?" Everly asked, watching their daughters with the mixture of love and wonder that still caught her by surprise sometimes. "The harvest party? All of it. The way we found each other, the way we built this. Think they'll remember that families can be made instead of just inherited?" Toby pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair that still carried hints of wood smoke and fresh air. "I think they'll remember that home is something you choose to build with people brave enough to choose you back." As stars began appearing in the darkening sky and the girls finally concluded their pumpkin ceremony with what appeared to be a group hug involving agricultural produce, Toby realized that courage had never been about fearlessness after all. It had been about looking at the people who mattered most and deciding that love was worth whatever risks came with it. 3 years ago, a Coast Guard officer and her twin daughters had sought shelter in his barn during a storm. Tonight, they were home in every way that mattered, surrounded by the kind of love that grows stronger with time and challenge rather than weaker. Sometimes the best rescues, Toby thought, were the ones where everyone saved everyone else. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us